They say the cold remembers everything. It keeps the echoes of every step ever taken across its frozen skin, the breath of every creature that has dared to live beneath its endless sky. The mountains of Alaska hold that memory the way the ocean holds salt, quietly, eternally, without asking permission. To live here is to live inside that memory, to breathe air so pure it burns your lungs, to feel a silence so deep it begins to sound like a voice. Up here, the cold is not an enemy. It's a teacher, an ancient, patient, and merciless at the same time. Long before roads reached this far north, before maps had names for these valleys, there were people who called this place home. They didn't come here by accident. They didn't stumble into the cold and hope for mercy. They belonged. The native people had mastered the art of balance between warmth and cold, hunger and abundant solitude community. They learned to survive in a land that looked impossible to live in, and the most astonishing truth of all was that for centuries they did it without fire, not because they couldn't make it, but because sometimes fire was not the answer. It's hard to imagine in a world where the smallest drop in temperature sends us reaching for switches, thermostats, heated blanket. But the first people of these mountains understood warmth different. To them, it was not something created by burning. It was something released from within. They knew the cold intimately, its rhythm, its moods, the way it moved through the body and the land. They knew that warmth was not a gift of flame, a dance, breath, body, and earth. When you stand alone on the tundra, surrounded by the white horizon that swallows all sense of distance, the air so sharp it cuts your skin like glass, you begin to understand the kind of wisdom that comes from silence. There's a moment the sound of your own becomes the only rhythm left in the world. The snow under your boots doesn't crunch, it whispers. The sky above you doesn't glow. It hums faintly like the pulse of something ancient. That's when you realize that survival here was never about the cold. It was about listening to it. The elders used to say that the earth keeps a slow fire buried deep within it, not a flame, but a warmth that rises softly through the soil, hidden under layers of ice and moss. The old people slept close to that warmth. They built shelters half sunk into the ground, walls made from sod, snow, roofs of animal hide stretched tight to trap the air. Inside, they used moss, grass, and fur not only as bedding, but as insulation. Every breath added to the warmth. Every body became a small sun. They knew how to keep heat escaping, how to breathe in rhythm, so that the air itself seemed to pulse with life. But the real secret, the trick that carried them through centuries of frozen nights, was far more subtle than architecture. It was the body itself, the living furnace. They had learned how to preserve heat by mastering their own. Through movement, breath, and deep understanding of the body's fire, they stayed warm even when the world froze around them. It wasn't mystical. It was practical wisdom, refined through generations. They called it many names, but one of them translates roughly to the remembering heat, the warmth that lives in, passed down from the sun, fed your ancestors. They wore layers of caribou and seal skin, each designed breathe, not. The inner layers caught the body's warmth, the outer layers repelled wind and moisture. The hides were treated with oils from fish and whales, creating a barrier that water could not penetrate but air through. The trick was to never let sweat freeze against the skin, so they moved slowly, deliberately, conserving their energy the way one conserves breath underwater. Their survival was not a battle against the elements, a conversation with. When night came, the wind would roar through the valleys, a living thing, sharp enough to cut through bone. But inside those small earthen homes, a family huddled, wrapped in layers and moss. The parents placed the youngest in the middle, the elders along the outer edges, all breathing together in rhythm. The heat that escaped from one became the protection of another. In that circle, they were more than individuals. They were a single organ, a heartbeat echoing through the dark. Sometimes, when the snow buried the entrance, the night stretched endlessly without dawn, they would hum softly, low-toned, long and steady. The vibrations filled the space, keeping their minds anchored while their body. That hum, they said, was another kind of a sound of life refusing to go silent. The first outsiders who came here couldn't comprehend. They looked at the people, simplicity, not strength. They wondered how anyone could live without smoke rising from the camps, how they didn't freeze to death when the temperature dropped so low that the air itself felt brittle. But the native Alaskans understood something strangers did not. Fire is only one kind of warmth. There are others. The warmth of movement, of closeness, of stillness. They didn't need to fight the cold because they had learned to live inside it. To modern eyes, it might seem like magic, but it was science born of intuition and patience. They knew how snow itself could become insulation. Fresh snow full of air pockets traps heat better than wood. So they built snow shelters, igloos, though that word hardly captures their beauty. Inside, the temperature would rise to near freezing, while outside it might drop to 60 below. The difference between death and life was often just a few inches of packed snow, the breath of a single human body. And even then the wisdom went further. They lined the ground with evergreen branches to prevent contact with the cold earth. Above that, layers of moss and fur created a cradle of living warmth. When you lay down there, surrounded by silence and breathing air warmed by your own lungs, you could feel the rhythm of the planet. The cold was still there, pressing against the walls, but it couldn't touch. It only watched, patient, distant, as if respecting the mastery of those who understood its language. Many nights sat out there alone, far from any road or light, and thought about knowledge, about what it means to live in a world that doesn't bend for you. There's a kind of honesty in this cold civilization can't reap. You can't fake warmth. You can't pretend to belong. Either you understand the balance, or the land will remind you who's in charge. The people who lived here first didn't just survive, they belonged so completely that even their breath felt native to the air. Their trick, their centuries-old secret, was born from humility. They didn't try to dominate the world around them. They didn't curse the snow or fear the wind. They learned slowly and carefully how every element could become an ally if treated with respect. The cold that kills one man keeps another alive if he knows how to listen. They taught their children early that comfort is earned, not granted. The young ones learned to read the snow by its sound, the difference between a layer that would collapse and one that would hold their weight. They learned how to breathe through their noses. The air would warm before reaching the lung, how to press their hands beneath their arms to keep blood flowing, how to eat slow burning fats that gave steady energy instead of sudden heat. They didn't just live in the cold, they mastered it until it became part of who they were. You can still feel traces of that life today. In the villages tucked along the coastlines, in the quiet eyes of the elders who remember stories that were never written down, they speak of winter, where the world seemed to stop turning, when the stars hung low like frozen embers, and the people endured with nothing but their knowledge and their breath. They speak of how warmth was sacred, never wasted. Even the smallest flame, when used, was shared. The cold made them generous because it taught them the value of every degree of heat, every ounce of energy, every heartbeat that stayed strong through the night. If you've ever slept in true silence, in a place where your own breathing, the only sound for miles, you'll understand a piece of what you felt. There's something deeply human that awakens the cold. It strips away the unnecessary, the artificial, and leaves only what matters: the body, the mind, the rhythm of the earth beneath you. Up here, there's no space for illusion. The wind doesn't care who you are. The mountain doesn't remember your name. And yet, if you stay long enough, you begin to feel something strange, acceptance. The cold accepts you, not because you deserve it, but because you've stopped fighting it. That was their truce. They didn't resist the world. They harmonized. Their warmth wasn't stolen from fire. It was given back by the earth. And when dawn finally came, when the first pale light crawled over the frozen ridges, they rose slowly, shaking the frost clothes, their eyes calm and unhurried, because they had not merely survived the night, they had lived it. When I stand here now in the same silence, I think of them. I think of what it means to carry such knowledge through generations, to trust the body more than the flame, to know that the warmth you need most is the one that comes from within. Maybe that's what we've lost in our search for comfort, the ability to endure without fear, to find strength in simplicity. The mountains still remember. The wind still whispers the same lessons it gave them centuries ago. And sometimes, if you close your eyes and breathe deeply, you can feel it too, that quiet, steady heat that doesn't burn, doesn't fade, but waits patiently inside you, the body's own fire. So if you're listening now, if you've ever wondered what it means to truly belong to the land, tell me where you're, because somewhere beneath all the layers of noise and comfort, same ancient warmth still lives, waiting. There was a time when the man did not live in the mountain. It seems impossible now, looking at him move through the snow as if he were born of it, but once he belonged to the noise and warmth of the lowland. He walked streets that hummed with engines, sat in rooms filled with the stale heat of electric air, and woke to the sound of machine instead of wind. There was a time when he thought that kind of life was comfort, that safety was found in walls and schedule. But comfort, he would later realize, can be the softest form of captivity. The journey that brought him here did not begin with a grand decision. It began with small silence, cracks that appeared in the rhythm of his days. He used to wake up before dawn, staring at the ceiling of a home that felt less like a place of rest and more like a cage. He had people around him, yet felt unseen. The world outside his window moved too fast, its noise constant, its meaning thin. There were moments when he'd stop in the middle of the street, surrounded by hundreds of faces, and realize he couldn't feel anything at all. The more he tried to fill that emptiness with work, with words, with noise, the deeper it became. There had always been something inside him, a quiet instinct that longed for simplicity. As a child, he would sneak away from home and wander into the woods. He remembered how alive the air felt there, how every sound had purpose. The crack of a branch, the flight of a bird, the whisper of wind through pine needles. The forest didn't ask him to be anything. It didn't demand answer. It just accepted his presence. But as he grew older, that world faded behind layers of obligation. The forest was replaced by office, the wind by the hum of screens, and his silence by the endless chatter of people trying to drown out their own emptiness. The breaking point came quietly, as all true endings do. He lost someone he loved, not to death, but to distance, a slow separation born not of anger, but of exhaustion. They had grown apart without realizing it, each drowning in the noise of their own small storms. When she left, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt hollow, as if even the air had forgotten how to breathe. For weeks, he lived like a ghost, going through the motion, feeding the body but starving the soul. Then one morning, he stepped outside and felt the wind on his face in a way he hadn't in years. It was cold, clean, unfiltered. It reminded him of something ancient, something that existed before he did. That day, he packed a single bag and left. No goodbye, no explanation, just a quiet understanding that the life he was living was not life at all. It was waiting. At first, he thought he'd go for a few weeks. He imagined he would walk until his thoughts cleared, camp for a while, and return renewed. But the longer he stayed, the less the old world called him back. The days began to stretch into something beautiful, strange. He would wake to the sound of wind sweeping through the trees and watch the light change slowly, almost reverent across. He started to notice the rhythm of the earth, slow thaw of frost, the migration of birds, scent of the air. Each detail was a conversation, each silence a companion. In the city, time had always chased him. Out here, time simply existed. He began to understand that loneliness and solitude were not the same thing. Loneliness is the absence of others. Solitude is the presence of oneself, and that presence was something he had never truly known before. The first winter was brutal, the kind of cold that punishes arrogance. He made mistakes, many of them. He built his shelter too shallow, underestimated the hunger that cold creates, and overestimated the strength of his own hand. There were nights when he lay awake, listening to the groan of ice shifting on the river, and wondered if he would see the sunrise again. But the mountain was patient. It taught through hardship, not cruelty. Every failure carved wisdom into him. He learned that fear is a teacher, not an enemy. The fear of freezing forced him to understand warmth in a new way. He remembered stories he'd heard about the Alaskan natives, how they survived for centuries without fire. That idea fascinated him. The thought that a man could live in the heart of winter and not depend on flame. He began to study their ways, reading what few records existed, observing animals, testing what worked. Slowly, he discovered the same truths they had known all along. He learned how to layer his clothing with air between each piece, to trap warmth inside his shelter, using snow and moss. He learned to sleep in rhythm with his breath, letting his body's heat circulate instead of escaping. And he learned the value of stillness. Movement creates warmth, yes, stillness preserves it. To sit quiet, wrapped in furs, breathing slowly, with snow drifted outside, that was when he felt most. He began to see beauty, the things he wanted. The howl of the wind became a song, the snow a blanket, the cold a mirror. It stripped away everything unnecessary. There were no lies in the cold, no mask, no illusion, just the raw, honest truth of existence. And in that truth, people sometimes imagine that isolate. The truth is, the world drives a man long before. Out here, he found a different kind of sanity, the kind that doesn't need validation, that doesn't crumble when left alone. He began to understand himself not as separate from the land, but as a part of it. His breath became wind, his heart became echo, his thoughts the slow rhythm of the mountain's pulse. Years passed quietly. The seasons turned like great gears, steady and eternal. He no longer counted days. He measured time by migration, by the color of the sky, by the way the river changed its voice between thaw and freeze. He built his home deep in the valley, near a frozen lake that reflected the world. The roof was low and curved, made from earth, invisible, distant. Inside was warm, not from fire. He learned to simply dried fish, roots, berries, summer, meat, and every meal was sacred because every bite had cost effort. He hunted respect, never taking more than he needed. The old people, when you live close to the earth, you stop thinking of survival as struggle and start seeing it as partner. Sometimes storms rolled down from the peak. He would sit inside and listen to the wind roar like a beast, searching for something it had lost. Those nights were long, but never empty. The sound reminded him that he was small, and that smallness brought peace. He no longer dreamed of the life he'd left behind. He didn't crave warmth from a hearth or light from a lamp. The mountain had given him something those things never could: clarity. One evening, as the sun bled slowly over the horizon, he thought of the people he'd known. He wondered if they ever found what they were looking for. He didn't feel regret, only understanding. The mountain had not taken him from the world, it had returned him to it. In the city, he had been surrounded by millions, yet felt alone. Here, he was alone and felt connected to everything. There's a strange paradox in solitude. At first it feels like loss. Then if you endure, it becomes abundance. You start to hear the voices hidden in silence, the wind, the snow, your own heartbeat. You realize that life doesn't need to be filled with noise to have meaning. It just needs to be lived fully, without fear of him. That was the lesson the cold had taught him. When travelers sometimes passed through, lost, curious, they would ask him how he could bear such isolation. He would smile faintly, the kind of smile that holds more memory than joy, and say, "I'm not alone. You only think I am because you can't hear what I hear." They never understood. They'd shake their heads, spend one night shivering in their tents, and leave at sunrise. But he knew that somewhere inside them, something had shifted. The silence touches everyone who listens long enough. Now, the years have folded into one another like layers of snow. The man's beard has turned white, his eyes sharper, calmer. The lines on his face are not from age, but from weather, the signature of a life lived honest. The world he left behind continues without him, loud and restless. But here, in this place of stillness, he has found the truth that escaped him all those years ago. Life is not about accumulation, but connection. And sometimes, on long nights, when the wind dies and the stars shimmer like frozen sparks above the ridge, he remembers the woman he once loved. He doesn't ache for her anymore. He thanks her silently because her leaving was what sent him here. Pain, after all, is just another kind of teacher. It pushes us toward the places we are meant to be. He has become what he was always meant to become, a part of the mountain, a keeper of its silence. The fire he once sought in others now burns quietly inside him, steady and unending. So, if you're listening to this now, wondering what drives a man to leave the world behind, remember this. Sometimes isolation is not escape, it's return. Return to the self, to the land, to the quiet truth that lives beneath the noise of life. And if you ever feel that call, if you ever sense that something inside you longs for silence, don't be afraid to listen. That silence might just be the beginning of who you truly are. And if this story has reached you somehow, somewhere far from here, take a moment to breathe and let me know where you are listening from. Because every journey toward stillness begins with a single moment of awareness. And maybe tonight, this is yours. In the mountains, silence is not the absence of sound. It's a presence. A living, breathing force surrounds everything and listens back. The man learned that early on, after the long winters, stopped feeling like punishment and began to feel like a kind of conversation. At first, he feared the quiet, the way it pressed against him at night, thick as snow, made him feel small and exposed. But with time, that same silence became his closest companion. It followed him wherever he went, not as emptiness, but as understanding. It was in the crunch of his steps over frost, in the slow rhythm of his breath, as in the soft creaking of the trees when the wind passed. The silence here wasn't lonely. It was. Each morning began before the cold hours before dawn, the truest test of will. He would rise slowly, every movement deliberate heat. His bed of furs, still warm from the night, released its comfort reluctantly as he stood and stretched, feeling his joints pop in the stillness. He'd step outside and face the horizon, a line of pale gray that promised another day of survival. The cold bit at his skin, but he no longer flinched. It was a greeting now, a reminder that he still belonged to the living. He would begin his day with small rituals. Quiet just shaped his world meaning. He checked the traps he'd set near the creek, their wooden frames hidden beneath snow and ice. He followed the faint trails of foxes and hares, reading their movements as though deciphering a secret language. Every track told a story, the weight of a step, the hesitation of a turn, the silent dance of life continuing through the frost. He had come to admire these creatures not as prey, but as teachers. They moved with purpose, wasting nothing. In their simplicity, they embodied wisdom that no book could hold. Sometimes he would go days without speaking. There was no need. Words were tools of the restless, and his restlessness had long since vanished. In the beginning, he used to talk to himself, to the wind, to the trees, even to the ghosts of memories that visited him in the long nights. But the mountain had taught him something greater. The world answers best in silence. When he stopped filling the air with his own voice, he began to hear what was always there: the low hum of the river under its skin of ice, the faint sigh of the snow settling after a storm, the distant cracking of a glacier, deep and resonant like the heartbeat of the earth itself. In those moments, he didn't feel alone. He felt small, yes, but not insignificant. The silence made him part of everything. It stripped away the false importance of human noise and returned him to something pure. The birds that stayed through the winter, the ravens and ptarmigans, would often perch nearby, watching him with curious. Sometimes he'd toss them a few crumbs of dried meat, and they'd accept the offering without fear. It felt like a small exchange of respect between two creatures that had both learned that survival is not about dominance, it's about balance. His body had changed over the years, molded by the rhythm of this quiet. The muscles had grown lean, not from exercise, but from endurance. His skin, toughened by wind and sun, had taken on the same roughness as the bark of the trees around him. His hands were scarred, his beard streaked with white, but his eyes carried the clarity of still water. They no longer darted with worry or raced with thought. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though they had learned to see what others could not. Food was simple, sacred. He took only what he needed. Each catch was followed by a whispered thank, not to a god, but to the cycle that had allowed it. He knew the animals by their patterns: the rabbits that nested under the same spruce, the caribou that crossed the valley in early spring, the fish that returned each year when the river thawed. He didn't hunt for pleasure. He hunted because the mountain demanded respect, and respect required reciprocity. Every life he took, he honored. Every meal was a ceremony of gratitude. Nights were the hardest, especially in the deep of winter, when darkness ruled for weeks at a time. There were evenings when the wind roared so fiercely that it felt like the whole mountain was alive, shifting, breathing with the storm. In those hours, he would sit near the center of his shelter, wrapped tightly in layers of fur, feeling the vibration of the world outside. He'd close his eye and focus the rhythm of his own breath, slow, steady, until the fear passed. Fear still came. Even after all the years, it never truly disappears. It only learns to sit quietly beside you. Sometimes, the storm ended, the world would fall into such perfect stillness that it felt unreal. The snow outside would shimmer beneath the pale light of the moon, unbroken and pure. He would step out then, careful not to disturb that untouched beauty. The air would be so cold that each exhale turned into a cloud that sparkled briefly before vanishing. Above him, the northern lights would ripple across the sky, green and violet curtains swaying in silence. He would stand there for hours, watching them, his face lifted, his heart still. There was no language that could describe what he felt in those moments, only a vast sense of belonging. He had come to understand that silence is not empty. It is full of memory, of movement, of meaning. Too deep for soundless landscape around him, alive, visible, the snow, music, the wind, the faint crack of ice, each note part of a greater song. And when he listened long enough, he could almost feel the mountain breathing. There were times, too, when silence became a mirror. It showed him the parts of himself he had long ignored, the anger, the fear, the grief he once buried beneath the noise of the world. Up here, there was nowhere to. They would come to him in the long hour of solitude, taking memory, thought. He learned not to run from them. Instead, he faced them one by one until they lost their teeth. The mountain does not allow lies, even the ones we tell ourselves. He often thought of the people he had left behind, though their faces begun to fade. He didn't resent them. He didn't resent the world he had abandoned. He knew now that not everyone is meant to live in silence. Some are born to the noise, to the pulse of cities, but he was not one of them. His place was here, where the heart of the earth beats slow and steady, where the air carries truth instead of words. Each day was work, but the kind of work that nourished rather than drained. He gathered wood, not to burn, but to build. He repaired tools, shaped new ones from stone and bone. He fished when the ice broke, dried what he caught, and stored it for the long freeze to come. His hands were always busy, but his mind was calm. He no longer measured success in progress or possession. Success for him was peace, and peace was something the world had forgotten how to value. The mountain had become his teacher, his companion, his mirror. It taught him patience through slow thaw and freeze, humility through hunger, and gratitude through hardship. There were days when everything went wrong. The trap the snow too soft to travel, the sky thick with gray that hid the sun for weeks. On those days, he did not curse. He accepted hard life. The rhythm he had learned was not supposed to be easy. Ease dulls the spirit. Struggle sharpens. Sometimes, when the snow melted and the streams ran clear, he would sit by the water's edge and watch the reflection of the mountains in the surface. He would trace the outlet eye, following the ridges that rose like great sleeping beasts. He often wondered how long they had been here, these ancient giants, and how many lives through their shadow. It reminded him that his existence, however small, was part of something vast and eternal. The silence taught him something else, too, how to listen to his own body. In the city, he had ignored it, fed it with noise and distraction. But here, every ache had meaning. The stiffness of his joints told him the weather would change. The dryness of his lips warned of snow. The rhythm of his breath told him when to rest. He had become fluent in the language of his own being, and in that fluency he found freedom. At night, before sleep, he would sometimes whisper to the dark. Not prayers, not confessions, just quiet words of gratitude. Gratitude for the cold that taught him endurance, for the silence that taught him truth, for the solitude that taught him peace. He never expected answers, and that was what made the ritual sacred. He had learned true conversation with the world doesn't need words. And so the days passed, blending into seasons, each one teaching him more about what it means to exist without needing to be seen. The world below went on, loud and restless, filled with people chasing warmth never lasts. But up here, the endless quiet, the man had found a different kind of warmth, one that no fire could give. If you've ever felt the weight of silence gently against your thoughts, if you've ever stood somewhere so still that you could hear your own heartbeat, then you already know a piece of what he lived. And if you don't, maybe it's time you find your own, even for a moment, and listen to what it's been trying to tell you. There are seeds in the mountains, not just the body, spirit. The man had lived through many winters, but one year came that would carve his name into the memory of the land. It began quiet, as all great trials do. The summer had been shorter than usual, the warmth weak and fleeting. The caribou had changed their path, moving further north earlier than expected. The fish in the river were fewer, and the moss he gathered to insulate his shelter had grown thin and damp. Nature was whispering a warning, though he did not yet understand its full weight. By late autumn, the air carried a sharpness that came too soon. The first snows fell heavy, wet, and fast, burying the earth in silence before it was ready. The lake near his home froze unevenly, trapping pockets of air that moaned at night like distant spirits. The wind shifted from steady to erratic, carrying the scent of something unfamiliar. He could feel the mountain changing its breath, and deep down, he knew that this winter would not be like the other. He spent the early days preparing as he always did, repairing tools, tightening the seams of his shelter, gathering roots and drying meat. His movements were calm, practiced, but beneath them lay a quiet unease. The mountain was restless, and he could feel it in his bones. When he woke in the mornings, frost clung to the inside of his walls. His breath hung heavy in the air, thicker than usual. He layered his furs carefully, adjusting them to trap every bit of warmth his body could produce. The first storm came early in November. It rose over the ridge like a living thing, swallowing the sky in a matter of hours. The wind howled so fiercely that it tore at the edges of his shelter, finding every small weakness in the seam. He worked through the night, pressing snow against the outer walls to seal the cracks, his hands numb, his breath shallow. By dawn, the world outside had disappeared beneath a white blindness. He waited 2 days before the winds eased, and when they finally did, stepped outside into a silence so deep it felt like standing at the edge of time. The storm had changed the landscape completely. The familiar trails were gone, buried beneath drifts taller than a man. The trees bowed under the weight of ice, their branches snapping like bones. The air was colder than he had ever felt, so cold it burned his lungs with every breath. He tested the ground carefully, using a long stick to probe the snow for hidden voids. But even that simple act, the world had become a labyrinth of white. For days, he stayed close to his shelter, rationing his food and serving it. He knew that the real danger was not hunger or even but complacence. The mountain rewards attention and punishes distraction. One mistake, a slip, a crack in the ice, a misjudged distance, could end everything. He kept his mind sharp by observing small details, the way the smoke of his breath moved in the air, the way the snow settled after each gust, the faint sounds of shifting ice in the lake. He had learned long ago that survival strength, but awareness. Then came the night, changed everything. It began with sound, a low groaning deep as if the mountain were turning. He stepped outside, strained, heavy. Sky glowed faintly green in the northern lights, but below that beauty was something else, a vibration he could feel through the soles of his feet. He realized too late what it was. The ice on the lake was fracturing. The sound grew louder, echoing across the valley, a crack so deep it seemed to split the night itself. He moved quickly, instinct guiding him toward higher ground. Behind him, the ice gave way with a thunderous roar, sending shards flying like shattered glass. Water erupted through the break, steaming in the cold air. He watched as the frozen surface he had trusted for years tore itself apart, swallowing everything near the shore, including the line of traps he had set the week before. He stood there in silence long after the noise faded. The loss was more than physical. Those traps had been his link to food, his rhythm of life through the winter. Without them, survival became uncertain. Fear, he reminded him, was useless. The mountain gives and takes without reason. It was not cruelty. It was balance. The following days were a blur of endurance. He built new traps farther inland, dug deep pits of snow to find edible roots, melted ice for water. When the river froze too thick, each task took twice the effort it should have. The cold had reached a depth that felt unnatural, seeping into the bones of the world. Some mornings, the horizon was so pale and still that it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the earth began. Then one morning, he found something unexpected. Near the base of a ridge, half buried in snow, he discovered an old structure, a hollow made of stone and sod, smaller than his own shelter, but carefully built. The shape was unmistakable. It was the remains of an ancient dwelling, likely abandoned for generations. He brushed away the snow and felt the rough texture of stones, perfectly aligned, still holding strong against time. Inside, the air was still and dry. The remnants of fur and moss lined. It was as if someone had lived there not long ago. He knew it must have been centuries. He spent the day studying touching the marks carved faintly into the stone. Simple symbols, perhaps, names, prayers. It was a moment of connection, a bridge between his solitude and the lives of those who came before. They, too, had lived through winters like this. They, too, had trusted the land and learned its language. He could almost feel their presence in the quiet, a reminder that survival here was never an individual act, but a continuation of something eternal. As he explored, he found a small pit at the center of the shelter. It was not for fire. It was too shallow, clean. He realized then what it was, a heat well, a place to gather the body's warmth, lined with grass and hide. The ancient people had built it to trap the heat of their own breath, to let life itself be the fire. Standing there, he felt an almost sacred reverence. He was not alone in his knowledge. He was walking in the footsteps of wisdom far older than his own. He spent that night inside the ancient shelter, surrounded by the echoes of those who once lived there. As the wind howled outside, he closed his eyes and imagined their voices, soft, rhythmic, speaking the language of endurance. It felt less like finding a ruin and more like finding a memory. The mountain, in its own way, had offered him a gift. Days passed, and he continued to return to them. He repaired parts of the old structure, adding new moss, tightening the stone gaps, making it livable again. It became a second home, a sanctuary. Storms grew too violent. And within that shelter, something inside him shifted. He began to see the world not as something he lived in, but as something he lived with. The mountain was not his challenge, it was his teacher. But the real discovery came not in the stones or the survival, but in himself. One night, as another blizzard raged outside, he lay awake, listening to the sound of the wind colliding with the mountain. He realized that for the first time in his life, he felt no fear. The storm was not against him. It was part of him. The cold outside was mirrored by the warmth inside his chest, steady and unbroken. He understood then what the Alaskan natives had always known. The true fire is not made of flame. It is made of breath, of spirit, of life that refuses to extinguish even when surrounded by frost. He had thought that isolation meant distance from others, but now he saw differently. Isolation had brought him closer to the mountain, to the ancestors, to the invisible threads that connect every living thing. The discovery was not about how to survive without fire. It was about remembering the fire had always been there, quietly waiting within him. When the storm finally broke and dawn spilled across the peaks like a slow awakening, he stepped out. The world was renewed, sharp, silent, infinite. He looked out over the frozen valley, shattered lake, the white ridges stretching into forever, and felt no triumph, no pride, only gratitude. Gratitude, trial, silence, for the reminder that life is not about conquering the world, but belonging to it. He turned toward the old shelter, now standing solid against the horizon, and whispered his thanks, not to gods or fate, but to the mountain itself. It had tested him, yes, but also revealed him. In that frozen world, he had discovered the oldest truth of all, that warmth does not come from fire or flesh, but from acceptance. To be at peace with the world, one must stop fighting it. If you've ever faced a storm that seemed greater than your strength, remember this. Sometimes the storm isn't there to destroy you. It's there to show you what you're made of. It's there to help you remember the fire that lives quietly. And if you find meaning in that thought, if it stirs something in you, then let that spark grow. Let it remind you that endurance is not cold, alive. If you stayed with me through this far-off story, take a moment to breathe and, if you wish, subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of it. Because what comes after the storm is not stillness, it's understanding. There comes a point in a man's solitude when the difference between the world inside and the world outside begins to dissolve. The silence he once sought for peace becomes something else entirely, a mirror, vast and unblinking. The mountain, once his refuge, begins to speak in quiet ways, not with words, but with moments that pierce through the stillness like light through fog. The man had lived among these peaks for so many years that he no longer thought of him separate from. Yet the more he belonged to this place, the more he began to see the strange truth of the world he had left. From up here, the world below seemed restless. The winds carried whispers of it, the faint echo of human noise, far away, never gone. Even without hearing the cities, He could feel them, their rhythm, their pulse, too. He sometimes faces rushing through their days, chasing time instead of living it, seeking comfort, never finding it. He had once been one of them. Now, the memory of that loud distance, like a dream, fading at the mountain, had stripped him bare, and in doing so, had given him back what the world had taken. Clarity. He often sat for hours watching the slow movement of clouds along the peaks, each one drifting like thought itself, forming and dissolving with struggle. That was how life should be, he thought, unhurried, present, without resistance. But humans forgotten this rhythm. They fought the natural order, trying to mold time and nature to their will. In doing so, they had lost the one thing the mountain gave freely. Peace. He remembered how, in his former life, silence made people uncomfortable. In conversations, they rushed to fill every pause, afraid of what might emerge if the quiet lingered. But up here, silence was not emptiness. It was full of meaning, of breath, of the simple presence of existence. The world below feared silence because it revealed truth, and truth was something few people could face. He thought often about why he had left that world. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't rejection, it was realization. Down there, everything was built upon distraction. People filled their lives with noise, with screens, with endless tasks, convincing themselves they were alive simply because they were busy. But busyness was not life. It was avoidance. They feared stillness because stillness forced them to look inward, and inward was where the real wilderness lay. The man had come to understand that the most dangerous kind of cold was not found in the mountains, but in the human heart when it forgets how to feel. In the cities, warmth came from artificial things, machines, lights, words of convenience. But that kind of warmth fades as soon as the power fails, the crowd disperses. The warmth that lasts, he learned, is the one that comes from connection to the land, to others, and to oneself. Sometime he would watch the sun rise and think of the generation before him, those who had lived without walls or wires, who had known how to listen to the rhythm of the earth. They had no illusions about control. They respected, could not. They saw the sacred in the ordinary, the crack of ice, the wisp of trees, the breath of sleeping animal. The world had been their teacher, not their servant. He had not spoken to another person in years, yet he had never felt more understood. The mountain answered him in ways no human ever could. It spoke through the weather, through the shape of the snowdrifts, through the silence between storms. It told him to rest. When he was careless, it reminded him with pain. When he was humble, it opened. That was the language truth, the kind that could only be heard in stillness. He sometimes wondered if humanity would ever learn to listen again, to see that the solutions they sought, peace, meaning, belonging, had always been waiting beneath the noise they created. The mountain had no religion, no politics, no endless debates about what was right or wrong. It simply was. It accepted everything, demanded nothing, and yet gave everything in return. To live here was to understand that existence itself was enough. You didn't need to prove it, you only needed to be. There were days when he missed the sound of another voice, not for conversation, but for the simple reminder of human warmth. He imagined what it would be like to tell someone what he had learned, to explain how silence can heal what words cannot, how endurance is not suffering, but clarity. But he also knew that most wouldn't understand. The world below had grown too fast, too loud. People no longer valued what could not be seen or measured. Sometimes he would carve small symbols into pieces of driftwood, marks inspired by the ones he had found in the ancient shelter. He didn't know exactly what they meant, but he felt they carried something human and eternal. He would leave those carvings across the valleys and ridges, letting the wind and snow take them. Perhaps one day someone would find one and wonder who had left it. Maybe they would understand the message without needing words. You are not separate from you are the world. In solitude, he had learned that survival was only the beginning. Once a man learns to survive, he must then learn to live. And living, truly living, is an act of awareness. Every drop of melted snow, every flicker of light on ice, every distant sound of a wolf's call, all of it came. He moved through the days with the grace of someone who no longer feared death, because he had already faced it in the long winters and learned that it was not an enemy, but a continuation. He began to understand that the cold did not only test, it purified. It burned away illusion, pride, and fear, leaving only what was essential. The mountain, like a mirror, never lied. If a man came here full of false strength, it would break. If he came here empty but open, it would fill him with truth. That was why he had survived so long. He had stopped fighting the mountain and had let it shape him instead. One day, during the long thaw of early spring, he sat by the river and watched the ice break apart. The sound was deep, thunderous, echoing through the valley like a voice from the heart of the earth. The water began to move again. He felt something within him shift. The thaw was not just in the land, it was in him. The man who had once come here to escape the world had become part of it in ways he had never imagined. The isolation that had once felt like exile had become belonging. He thought about what it meant to live without being seen, to exist without recognition or praise. In the world below, people feared that kind of. They wanted to be noticed, remembered, celebrated. The mountain had taught him the beauty of anonymity. A tree does not demand seen. A river does not beg to be heard. They exist, and that is enough. So should we. In that understanding, he found peace deeper than any comfort he had ever known. He no longer missed what he had lost. The love that had once broken him now existed only as gratitude. The memories that had once haunted him had softened into lessons. The past had dissolved into the present, and the present stretched endless like the horizon at dawn. He began to see that the greatest discovery of all was not how to survive the mountain. To face one's own mind without distraction is the hardest trial a man can endure. Up here, there was no one to blame, no one to save him, no noise to hide behind. Every flaw, every weakness, every fear was laid bare. But through that exposure came freedom. When you stop running from yourself, you realize that nothing outside you can truly harm you. The man had become both student and teacher. The mountain taught him through silence, and he, in turn, became a voice for that silence, even if no one ever heard it. Perhaps that was the purest form of truth, the kind that doesn't need to be shared to be real. He often imagined that one day, long after he was gone, someone might wander through these valleys and find traces, a stone wall, a carved mark, a piece of bone smoothed by years of touch. Maybe they would feel, even for a moment, the same quiet peace that had filled his days. That would be enough. Legacy, he realized, was not about being remembered. It was about leaving behind a small echo of understanding. As he sat beneath the fading light, the wind brushing softly against his face, he whispered to no one in particular, "The world does not need saving. It only needs listening." Those words drifted into the air and vanished, carried by the wind toward the horizon. Maybe they would reach someone somewhere far away, someone tired of noise and ready to listen again. And if that someone happens to be you, wherever you are, take this as a reminder. Peace is not found by adding more to your life. It is found by removing what doesn't belong. The mountain has always known that truth. The world has simply forgotten it. If this story speaks to you, if even a part of it feels like something you've been searching for, then stay close. There's more stillness to come. Sometimes the greatest lessons arrive in whisper, not shouts. Stay with me, and if you haven't yet, take a moment to follow, so you won't miss what the silence has to say next. There are mornings in the mountains when the world wakes slower than the heart, when the sun creeps over the ridge with such gentleness that it feels like the land is remembering how to breathe again. The man had seen countless dawns like that, yet each one felt new. as if time had folded upon itself and gifted him another beginning. The years had stopped meaning what they once. Days had become cycles, cycles had become seasons, and seasons had become silent. The mountain didn't count time. It carried it, and he, at last, had learned to do this. He was older now. The years had left their marks upon his face, etched deep like rivers carved in stone. His hair had turned the color of frost, his hands rough and scarred, but his movements were still steady, precise, filled with that quiet patience that only solitude can teach. Age, he had discovered, was not a thief in the mountains. It was a companion, a soft shadow that walked, reminding him to move slowly enough to see the world clearly. Each morning he still began with the same ritual. Step outside, breathe, listen. The air greeted him with its familiar sting, sharp. His breath rose in clouds, vanishing almost instantly. The snow around his shelter gleamed under the pale sun, untouched, except for the faint trail that led to the frozen. The same mountains that had once towered above him like gods now felt kin. He knew every ridge, every whisper of wind, every curve of the solitude that once seemed immense had become home. There was no longer a line between him. He no longer thought of himself as surviving here. He was simply living as naturally as the wolves, the trees, the rivers. The noise of the world below had faded completely. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard a human voice, and yet he never felt alone. The silence itself was company, but even in peace, the body remembers its fragility. The winters grew harder with each passing year, the cold cutting deeper, the storms lasting longer. His hands trembled now when he worked with tools, his breath shorter when he climbed. There were days when his reflection in the ice surprised him. The stranger with hollow cheeks and steady eyes looking back. He knew, without fear, that his time in this world was drawing near its end. He did not dread it. Death here was not an intruder. It was as natural as the falling of snow, as inevitable as the thaw followed. He had seen it many times before, in the animals that fed him, in the trees that split under frost, in the river that froze each winter and came back to life each spring. Everything that lived on the mountain belonged to that same rhythm. To fear death would have been to deny the mountain's truth. He often thought about what might happen when his body could no longer rise, when his last breath escaped into the frozen air. He imagined it without. The mountain would take him, as it takes everything. The snow would cover him gently, the wolves would pass without disturbance, and by the next thaw there would be nothing left, the quiet memory of breath. The land would reclaim him, not as loss, but as return. Sometimes, on calm evenings, he would sit outside and speak softly to the wind, not to ask for anything, but to thank it. He thanked the storm that had nearly broken him, the hunger that had taught him discipline, the cold that had shown him strength, the silence that had taught him to listen. He thanked the mountain for every hardship, because each one had been a teacher, disguised suffering. Every wound, every scar had been part of his becoming. There were moments when he thought of the world below, the faces long forgotten, the places he once was. He wondered if anyone remembered him, if his name had faded entirely. He knew it likely had. He had not written letters, left no message, no mark of proof. But that thought brought him peace, not regret. He realized that legacy is not about remembrance. It's about continuity. The true legacy of a life is not in who recalls your name, but in what remains because you lived. He had left something behind, even if invisible, a way of being, a story that the wind would carry long after his breath was gone. Perhaps a traveler would one day stumble upon the ruins of his shelter, find the carvings he had made, and wonder who had lived there. Perhaps they would feel, even for a moment, the same serenity that had filled his days. That would be enough to live quiet and leave behind stillness. That was his kind of immortality. The mountain had given him everything a man could ask for: peace, purpose, and the kind of truth that no book or teacher could ever offer. In return, he had given it his life. Willingly, gratefully, he had become its caretaker, its witness. When he watched the sun set, he no longer saw it as an ending. The fading light was just another turn of the eternal circle. The world did not mourn the passing of days, neither did he. One winter evening, the sky bled into violet. He felt a deep stillness settle over the valley. The wind stopped. The trees stood silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. He sensed something shifting, not in the air, but in himself. His strength was leaving him. He sat on the small wooden stool outside his shelter, wrapped in his thickest furs, and watched the horizon. The snow glowed faintly under the half-moon. He could hear the distant crackle of expanding a sound he had come to love. It was the voice of the earth reminding him that everything, silence, is alive. He felt no fear, no sorrow, only gratitude. Gratitude for every dawn he had seen, for every night he survived, for every lesson written in frost. He closed and let his breath slow. Feeling the warmth inside, quiet kept him alive through all. It was still there, strong and steady. It did not fade as his body weakened. It grew brighter, as if preparing to return to the source from which it came. As he drifted between waking and sleep, memories rose gentle. The first time he saw snow fall without fear, the moment he built his first shelter and realized he would live, the discovery of the ancient dwelling. The night he watched the aurora shimmer above the peaks, realizing he was no longer a stranger. And beneath it all, the faint memory of the world he had left behind, its noise, its rush, its endless hunger for more. He forgave it, finally, not because it had wronged him, but because it did not know any. The world below had forgotten how to listen. But perhaps one day someone would remember. When dawn came, soft and golden, it found him sitting peacefully where he had fallen asleep, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes half open as if still watching the horizon. The wind moved through his hair, gentle and kind. The first light touched the mountain, received him with sound. Without the man and the land had become one at last. In time, the snow buried his shelter, the trails disappeared, the marks he had made were softened by seasons. The story did not vanish. The mountain remembered. The wind carried his name in ways no language could repeat. The valley held his breath in its silence, and those who passed through, even if only once, felt something they could not explain. A calm, quiet awareness, the echo of a life lived in harmony with everything. Years later, travelers would sometimes speak of a strange feeling crossing that ridge. Some said they heard whispers in the wind, like the rustle of old words. Others claimed to dream of a man walking through snow, calm and unhurried, his face hidden, none his presence kind, but all agreed that something sacred lingered there, a peace belonged not to religion or myth, but to truth. And so, his legacy lived on, not in monuments or books, but in the silence itself, in the breath of those who stopped long enough to live, in the stillness between storms, in the awareness that warmth can exist without flame, that peace he found with noise, and that life, even in isolation, full beyond measure. If you have stayed with me until this final breath of the story, then perhaps you understand what he discovered, that the world does not owe us meaning. It gives us the raw materials, and it is we who must shape them into truth. The mountain does not promise safety, but it offers understanding. The cold does not forgive, but it teaches. The silence does not speak, but it answers. And maybe that is the secret he left behind, hidden in the wind, carried through the years for anyone ready to hear it. You do not need to escape the world to find peace. You only need to stop fighting it. So if this story has reached you, if it has stirred something inside you, take a moment now, wherever you are, to be still, to listen, to breathe, to remember that you are part of the same earth, the same rhythm, the same silence that cradled the man in the mountains. And when you finish listening, if you feel the warmth of that truth in your chest, let it live a little longer. Leave a comment, share this story, subscribe so that others may find it too, because peace shared is peace multiplied. And somewhere in the quiet between your heartbeats, the mountain is still listening.